Chair, members of the committee. I need to check and see if there is a substitute. I do not think there is. To move. There's a line amendment, so I would move the line amendment or ask for someone to move the line amendment. Sorry.
Madam Chair, can we have him explain to us what the amendment does?
Delegate Garrett, why don't you just tell us about your line amendment?
Strike the word collaboration and add the word partnership.
Okay. Without objection, the amendment is before us. And go ahead and describe your bill.
Thank you,
why
Madam
we need
Chair.
it.
Never before have I had a line amendment so simple. Madam Chair, members of the committee, in the military, we talk about TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. In the healthcare world and others, we talk about evidence-based practices. We talk about best practices. And what these are things that we have learned over the course of time from experience. And this experience is paid for, in many instances, via tax dollars or time. In this instance, tragically, all too often, this experience is paid for not only in our tax dollars, but in our children's blood. In 1990, the federal government passed the Gun-Free School Zones Act. In 94, we had the Gun-Free Schools Act. In 1999, we had the Columbine shooting. In 2016, in Townville, South Carolina, there was a shooting where a elementary school student died because the educators who were present, who would have done anything to save that little boy, simply didn't know what to do. In 2018, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and there's a book entitled Why Meadow Died, there were any number of tactics, techniques, procedures, evidence-based practices, best practices, protocols that were not followed. And indeed, in Virginia, we have paid to amalgamate these lessons that we have learned in the form of funding the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety, from whence this bill is taken. We pay for that with our tax dollars. And in 2007 in Virginia Tech, we paid for it in the blood of our students. But to this day, there is absolutely no requirement tied to accreditation that would indicate that our schools need to understand and implement these evidence-based practices, these best practices, these tactics, techniques, and procedures. And I can outline them for the committee to some degree by virtue of having carried this bill. I understand them, but they're not that difficult. At Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, they had fire alarms that were tripped by gunfire. And they knew this, and they had funding to replace those for 2 years, but they hadn't gotten around to it. As a result, when the shooting began, which was perpetrated by a young man about whom the schools had been warned repeatedly, but they didn't implement best practices, when the shooting started, instead of going into lockdown, the students fled into the hallways, creating a horrific scene that led to the death of multiple young people. And so what this bill would do is take the best practices, the evidence-based procedures, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we know can save lives in the case of the most horrific and unimaginable tragedies that happen once is more often than they should, Madam Chair, but that happen all too often, and ensure that our schools understand these evidence-based lessons so that if these tragedies arise in our communities, they can implement these best practices. And that is the scope and extent of the bill.
Do we have questions from members of the committee? All right, I guess we're ready to go to our in-person testimony. Do we have people here to testify in